which extent is prayer a solution to the need of communication from System 2 to System 1? So Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky came up with this idea in their book Thinking Fast and Slow, that one could make a model of the mind that would be System 1, the fast thinking, the subconscious, and System 2, the rational part, the slow thinking part. And so I have been thinking quite a bit about this, and I also read a few books on this, and so these ideas are not necessarily from me, but I also don't want to credit any specific source apart from maybe Thinking Fast and Slow. I maybe also want to go into a couple of other sources, but I don't want to misinterpret basically what others have said. And so I have been thinking about this, and I have been thinking about that religion to a certain extent seems to be fulfilling the function of communicating with the subconscious. Now, there are, to a certain extent, one could say that the subconscious is the part of one's mind, and also maybe one's body, that one cannot really control. One could also make the group of the subconscious as the body, so basically group the body as well as the subconscious together into one bin, of course again simplifying. But if one doesn't simplify and one says, okay, if I am higher on cortisol and lower on testosterone and higher on this and lower on this, then it becomes quite a complex situation. If one then has all of these on and off switches, then one ends up with lots of different variables, even if one not only lots of different variables, but lots of different possible states. If one not only has the on and off switches for like something like cortisol, I'm either on cortisol, on high cortisol, or I'm on low cortisol, but one then assumes also there are many states in between. So this simplification of, okay, there is this System 1 and System 2, and therefore there are these two states, not necessarily two states, but these two entities in one's own mind, or in the general human mind, makes it somewhat simple. Of course, it's a model, so therefore it is quite simple, but therefore it also is quite wrong, the more simpler it is, often at least. So now, system, it seems, at least to me, in kind of my experience, and also to a certain extent it seems more and more obvious, at least in the books I have been reading, that what I am thinking that I am is not necessarily what I actually am, but is much more what it feels kind of to be conscious. So if there is a stream of consciousness, and so the general question maybe one could ask is, do I think, or do I only think that I think? And so if I only think that I think, in order to maybe because this is an optimization towards giving System 2 somewhat of an autonomy, at least a kind of believed autonomy, then if I just think that I think, now then what would be the purpose of the prayer? But clearly, so it seems, so this is another thought. It seems also, this is stemming from a book on artificial intelligence I recently listened to, and so there is this idea that, I think it was actually from Superminds, which was a book a couple of years ago actually, not specifically on artificial intelligence, but on, well, superminds. And so in there he describes, I think, the author describes, at least if this is from this book, is that by separating a artificial intelligence or a given program into multiple entities that then again have to work as kind of different entities together to find a solution, one is basically driving optimization overall in the solution. And so this system maybe might also be something that is already implemented in the human mind. So if one has two distinct entities that kind of think that they are autonomous, with the subconscious maybe not thinking that it is autonomous, but at least me, so the System 2 thinking that it is to a certain extent at least autonomous, then maybe this drives overall optimization. So basically the solution finding process is more optimal if one basically has these distinct entities that have to kind of criticize each other, instead of one entity just thinking and blurting out everything it has to say. Somewhat similar to how current large language models just write without thinking about it, and then there is the introduction of ChatGPT 4o, which now seems to additionally tie time to, so basically set time aside to process the thing. I don't quite understand it that well. Actually, I don't understand it maybe at all. That is just what I heard about the new model, ChatGPT 4o. It's not, I'm not sure. So there is the Omni model, and there is also another new model, which also seems to, in terms of the IQ ranking, seems to be significantly higher compared to the rest of the models from OpenAI, but also the rest of the competition. So back to prayer. what if now system 2 doesn't necessarily have a very good way to communicate to system 1? So system 1 already has these multiple distinct ways to communicate with system 2. If system 2 thinks it is time to eat, then it makes me hungry. And it makes me often hungry up to the point where I cannot override this any longer with my system 2 authority. So in terms of the roles of system 1 and system 2, one could think of as system 1 maybe as the owner of the overall system, with the system being the body and the mind. The owner maybe also, but not necessarily, so it's not necessarily the CEO. So the CEO is maybe the system 2, but the CEO is also only an employee, and the CEO often is not directly the owner or the founder of a company. So the CEO is only an employee, and that also takes time off, but it also can be made to take time off, and that also can be sent to infinite holiday, at least in theory. So the actual power, the authority, is lying basically within the founder or the owner role, which would be system 1, but the system 2 has kind of the granted rights to authorize decisions, maybe to also employ other people, or to make kind of different sub-programs, which then would be the kind of forebrain rules one can make up, such as, okay, it seems to make sense, according to Matthew Walker, that if I go to bed at the same time and stand up at the same time, that this drives overall sleep quality up, maybe average sleep quality over a given year, even though system 1 often would think that maybe an additional hour would be more useful, or system 1 often makes me think in the evening, or makes me stressed in the evening, and then I would actually maybe work for an additional 2 or 3 hours or something like this, or not necessarily work, but work on a problem, for example, that I have in my private life, or something like this. So back to now prayer. Religion, to a certain extent, seems to fulfill many different functions. I have thought a little bit about this over the years. I also grew up in a somewhat religious community, one could say, and then in the last couple of years I identified mostly as probably an agnostic, someone who says, one cannot really say whether God exists or not exists. An atheist would be someone who definitely states that God doesn't exist. Now, the question, to a certain extent, is obviously why different religions have different. It's not the only question, but one of the questions would be that why do different religions believe in these very distinct systems of belief? That there is this God, and that there are many gods, and then there are these different systems. And the answer to this seems to be, to a certain extent, at least according to what I've read, and now also as a result of this, what I've been thinking, is that these different religions seem to just be, to a certain extent, made up, but to a certain extent also be kind of an optimization. And this optimization might be, to a certain extent, that religion is providing a channel to communicate from system 2 to system 1. And now a subcategory of this would be the actual prayer itself, so the kind of silent prayer itself. So over the last couple of years I began journaling. Before this I didn't really have time, or I didn't really set time aside to basically try to document things and try to write down things in order to just being as neutral as possible, or as neutral as possible, trying to kind of capture things in a neutral way, in order to maybe get some insight about things that are occurring, to maybe then have learned more in the future. Now, as I did this, to a certain extent at least, it seems that this allowed me to kind of just get these thoughts out. Now, as I get these thoughts out, these kind of more, sometimes it's more system 1 thoughts I am thinking, and sometimes it's more system 2 thoughts I am thinking, and I just am writing them. So what now if one doesn't write all the time, but one still wants to get these thoughts out? And there is also now this additional thing, which is that system 2 can be maybe thought as kind of the entity that is the most interested in one's own betterment in every possible way, because it is kind of inhabiting the same body at least. So if one then assumes that these two entities kind of have to work together anyway, then the goal of collaboration seems not that far off. So if we then assume there is a mutual goal of collaboration towards a better future, then it would make sense that both help each other out the best way they can. If they do this, then if I, for example, or what I think I am thinking, system 2 in this case, I'm thinking about a mathematical problem or about some problem I otherwise have, then system 1, over the course of the night, for example, makes me dream about these specific things and makes me act out these different things in order to maybe prepare my brain and to basically optimize my neural network towards towards a state in which it is then more ready to encounter the problems that then occur in the future. I have been also thinking that to a certain extent maybe nightmares provide, so there could be two functions or multiple functions of nightmares. I'm thinking, or have been thinking about two. So of course there might be more, and I also might have been thinking about more, and I only want to speak about these two. The first function would be that if one has an otherwise very low stress life, that the nightmare basically provides a function to increase the average stress over the course of a given time interval. So if I have a very chilled life for some reason, then but my body thinks it would be more optimal to at least test these systems every now and then to, if I then am haunted by a saber-toothed tiger, that my systems are then still ready and my adrenals are then secreting adrenaline or epinephrine, that basically every now and then my system 1 just checks that these systems are still running, which then might result in me, at least if I'm kind of conscious, not really conscious, but if I then remember my dream, that I think this was actually a nightmare because my system 2 had to kind of create this simulated environment for me, to a certain extent for me, but so system 1 creates this environment for a version of myself, for a version of system 2 that kind of experiences the whole thing and therefore has to go through this thing. But of course, there is also a part of me that actually is the architect of this entire experiment. So it's kind of, okay, we encapsulate an entity of ourselves into this tiny capsule, which then can be maybe more thought of system 2, and then there is also the overall architect of the system that then tries to basically manipulate the system 2 entity into maybe doing these different things, and at the same time it then secretes these hormones and neurotransmitters in order to maybe, well, the function is unclear, but what I'm what I'm to a certain extent assuming, or that at least is kind of the hypothesis, is that it could average out basically a low stress life with a higher stress dream life. And so this would be one function. I actually now forgot the second one, but now back to prayer and communication from system 2 to system 1. So system 1 has these many different ways it can already kind of make me think certain thoughts. For example, yesterday, or actually it was today, I think, I got back with the bike, and I then I walked away like 50 meters from the bike, and then I had this idea, maybe I just check additionally, or again, whether my bike is actually locked. And so I went back to the bike, and long and behold, if this is the proper phrase for this, it was actually not locked. And it almost never occurs that I don't lock my bike. It's like a 1 out of maybe 200 case that I don't lock my bike and that I walk back and then I see that I forgot this. But I did not have this idea. It was just like, oh yeah, it could be actually that my bike isn't locked. So system 1 kind of implemented this idea now in my head, kind of like in the movie Inception, where there's an idea that is not necessarily coming from the entity itself, but it's kind of implanted from the outside. But then system 2 is kind of thinking that this was its own idea all along, and then is also acting out this idea, or at least what then results out of this idea, the behavior that results out of this idea, as if the thought has occurred in itself, in the entity on its own. So now this is kind of also an example of system 1 then channeling or using a channel, which would be basically implanting thoughts. This could be also emotions. In the last couple of months I had a problem with eating probably too much tuna, which I suppose resulted in a mercury poisoning, a slight mercury poisoning, which probably did not do the best for my liver. So that's kind of the leading hypothesis I have. And now, over the course of these, maybe almost the last 1.5 years, it occurred to me, so I recognized a kind of a pattern. So system 2 recognized a pattern, which is that I begin to feel kind of very, very desperate about the future if I have tuna, and if then I also can feel my liver, which is on the right side here, actually is really getting hotter. At least that's what I assume it is. So on the left side, if I feel here, it's significantly colder compared to then here after I eat certain things, which I then assume overwork my liver to a certain extent. So in the leading in the next couple of hours afterwards, I often have this desperation about the future, which is then maybe to a certain extent basically my system 1 now indicating that there is something wrong, seriously wrong, and that system 2 now better figures out what the overall pattern of this is, because system 1 at this point in time seems to not be able to figure it out. So it's kind of to a certain extent, it's a cry for help, one could say. Look, we have this problem, you're doing something, and I cannot handle this. I mean, if this goes on like this, then there might be the end of all of it, of the both of us in a couple of years, if you are still continuing to overwork our liver this much. Now, this is another example of system 1 now, supposedly communicating to system 2. But now, what if system 2, have a problem which I cannot solve, but I need access to the much bigger computational power of system 1? What do I do? So one way would be to maybe... So basically, what I'm thinking is that the solution to this is that one tries to think and one tries to repeat these thoughts and to basically also mark these thoughts with kind of maybe alertness, or at least with maybe overall importance. So if one marks these thoughts with importance, which also seems to be the way system 1 marks memories, for example, with importance. So Andrew Huberman, I think, talked about this, that if you have a car accident, or at least I got it probably from the Huberman Lab podcast, I don't know if he specifically mentioned this, but it seems to be the case, at least to what I have listened to, is that dopamine seems to a certain extent increase basically how detailed the time resolution is. So if there is something that is particularly important, such as a car crash, such as the seconds before a car crash, then there seems to be, maybe it's not only dopamine, maybe there are also other neurotransmitters as well that play into this overall factor that then is basically the importance. Let's just assume there is an importance factor from 0 to 1. And the more important a certain entity in one's own self marks an event or a memory, or basically the sensory information that comes in at any point in time, that the higher the likelihood of it being stored, but to a certain extent maybe also being replayed is. And so if I now need to mark, with me being system 2 again, mark something that is very important and basically hand it over kind of in a letter kind of fashion to system 1 to maybe think about this, and to maybe think about this only not in a way like, okay, I thought about this for 2 minutes and here is the solution, but maybe in a way that is like, okay, let's figure this out in a dream that lasts like 2.5 hours in total over a given night, or let's think about this over the course of the next couple of weeks, because this is really something that's really important to me, system 2, and because we are both interested in the both of our improving towards a better future, that then basically it would make sense for the both of us to collaborate on this problem. And so now prayer would, to a certain extent, I think, allow this, that one says, okay, and also the structure of prayer, like there are certain things I can control, there are certain things that are out of my control, which would be basically under the control of this thing, which often is referred to as God. So if this thing, which is often referred to as God now, is this entity that has to a certain extent power over us, because otherwise it would not make sense to pray to this power, because that's kind of the... One recognizes that there are things one can control, which are then one's own responsibility, and if one does not fulfill one's own responsibility, one then kind of excuses oneself. There are things that I did wrong, there are things that I did right, I'm proud of this, I'm not proud of that, please help me do these things better in the future, because it is really important to me for the following reasons. And so also, there are now many functions I wanted to talk about maybe for a quite long time. Maybe this is also the reason this is getting quite long. So one function is that there is this ultimate authority that sees everything. And this is also maybe to a certain extent a social control function, one could say. Because if there is no entity that controls everything, how do you then control the behavior of maybe hundreds of thousands of people that you want to have to adhere, that you want adherence or high compliance with a certain rule set that would make sense for basically the progress of an overall society, if one wanted to influence the outcome, or if one wanted to influence basically the vector of a given society towards the future. Now, this is maybe one function, but also for one's self now, if there is no entity apart from oneself that kind of looks out for oneself, and is also holding oneself accountable, then then maybe this is kind of a worse situation in terms of behavioral optimization than if there is such entity that kind of sees everything. There is also this psychological effect that if one has an eye, maybe up on the desk somewhere, or there is also an eye on many different in many different cultures. There are these. The Eye of Horus is something, I think, if I can remember this correctly, maybe I don't. But the eye seems to be something that indicates kind of, or at least reminds us of another entity possibly being watching, which then seems to kind of drive compliance with a certain rule set that one then lives under. And so if one has this entity that first of all can control things that are beyond one's control, but one also has a way to communicate with this entity, and that sometimes at least this entity seems then to actually act out the things one has requested, then this might result in maybe different beliefs about this thing that one cannot control, which then maybe actually is the subconscious, but one just has found kind of a better way to communicate with the subconscious because one sets aside time, and one tries to basically go over a given time interval and pick out the most important things one has done, the things one is responsible for, the things one is not responsible for, therefore also kind of alleviates oneself of the otherwise lingering responsibility for things that one did wrong, for example, and therefore kind of forgive oneself to a certain extent and basically say, okay, this is not my responsibility, I just sorted it into the bucket of, okay, this is out of my control. And the next thing is then that one also now has a channel to communicate with this thing that can control certain portions of the life, but then and provide solutions, maybe overnight, the solution to a mathematical problem, but at the same time is not really directly something that is responsive, and so one has to basically put aside this time and put in the effort and make these kind of statements or make these explanations or request basically the computation for a certain problem that then might be delivered, but one also at the same time realizes that this power is greater than oneself and that this power does not necessarily have to help oneself. And so these are kind of the functions I thought about, why it would maybe make sense that prayer as a subcategory of maybe religion, as a kind of a channel to communicate with the subconscious, is maybe to a certain extent actually a solution for communicating with the subconscious, so basically as a system 2 to system 1 communication channel.